From the i24 News Studios in Times Square in New York, this is Clearcut with Michelle Makori.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The U.S. and its allies are taking a stand. Today, the Trump administration joined with the United Kingdom and 21 other nations expelling Russian officials by the dozens. The move, retaliation for the poisoning of a former spy on British soil. The message to America's allies was clear.
We obviously stand united with allies that believe in the rule of law.
In all, 60 Russians will have until next week to leave the United States. Some diplomats, some tied to intelligence gathering. The U.S. is also closing the Russian consulate in Seattle. The U.S. ambassador to Russia saying that this isn't just about diplomacy, it's also about spying.
Today's actions make the United States a safer place by limiting the ability of Russia to spy on Americans.
Well, it's clear the Russians will respond, but how and when is still unknown. The Russian ambassador to the U.S. trolling America with a Twitter poll asking which U.S. consulate the Russians should close. All right, let's bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Dan Raviv. Dan, what's the latest? What are we hearing from the Russians?
Well, we don't know the official Russian response yet. Keep in mind that as we're speaking now, it's the middle of the night in Moscow, but chances are within hours we'll see the Russian retaliation, and not just against the United States, but the more than 15 other nations that also have expelled Russian diplomats. Generally, if a nation kicks out 2 Russians, you'll find Russia kicking out 2 diplomats of that country, often saying that they were spies. In this case, the U.S. expelling 60, that's big. And forcing the Russian consulate in Seattle, Washington to close. The Trump administration specifically says that the Russian consulate was spying on the nearby Boeing aircraft facility and a submarine base. Assuming that President Vladimir Putin does expel 60 Americans, you can count on Moscow claiming that they're all CIA agents. Michelle?
Right. Dan, President Trump has said that he would rather have good relations with Russia and to get Russia to cooperate on many issues. Do you think that this indicates a shift from that?
It sure does look that way. Kind of surprising, but it's as though President Trump had a choice, right? You side with Great Britain and other NATO alliance members, or you side with Moscow. Well, that was too much. The United States definitely decided it's on Britain's side, right? It was on British territory that there was an attempt to murder a former Russian spy, and just about everybody says that Russia did that, and even President Trump says it sure does look like Russia did it. What's next? White House spokesman Rod Shah had this to say.
Our relationship with Russia is frankly up to the Russian government and up to Vladimir Putin and others in senior leadership in Russia. We want to have a cooperative relationship. The president wants to work with Russia, but their actions sometimes don't allow that to happen.
Saying it's all up to Russia. In other words, blaming Russia for all this trouble. I would expect the Trump administration to say that it still wants good relations with Moscow. But, you know, there was an attempt to have good relations with China. And then about a week ago, President Trump slapped tariffs on some products from China. The result there, apparently some negotiations. The result of having the return of a little bit of Cold War with Moscow, we still don't know. Stay tuned. Michelle?
Maybe it's all a part of the art of the deal. Dan Raviv, thank you so much. Good to have you. All right, let's bring in my panel. Don Bramer is the founder and chairman of the Bramer Group, and Tom Borelli, a contributor for the Conservative Review. Gentlemen, good to have you with us. And Don, I'd like to start with you because this is building into what could be the most serious diplomatic crisis between Russia and the West since Moscow's seizure of Crimea. We had a remarkable show of solidarity with Britain. What's your reaction to this?
Well, I think, first of all, this is an amazing reaction by the EU and our partners. Across the board, we had a coordinated effort today that sent a clear message to Moscow that these type of activities on the soil of our allies is not going to be tolerated. We've come together, we've expelled countless intelligence officers and diplomats, and basically the word of the day is persona non grata.
Tom, there was concern that the Trump administration was not that committed to NATO, the president wanting NATO countries to step up their financial contributions, some of which have subsequent to that. What does this signal about the U.S. and the NATO relationship?
I think it's strong, and we can thank Russian President Vladimir Putin for that, because he clearly overplayed his hand by using a chemical agent, a nerve agent, on UK soil, and he's also had cyber attacks against our energy infrastructure. So when President Trump was talking about NATO, he just wanted them to spend their 2% commitment of their GDP to the defense budget. That's what they all agreed to. Now, I believe many of them are stepping up because we do face international threats, but if you're united, and that's the most important thing about today's action, it shows a united front really can mitigate any kind of nefarious activities by Russia or anybody else.
Don, is expelling these diplomats sufficient in terms of multilateral action towards this?
Well, I think it's a good first step. If you look back a week ago, the president and the administration, we lashed out with a set of sanctions. That was an excellent first step, and I think appropriately this was the good second step to have where we're sending these folks home. We're letting them know that it's not going to be business as usual, and that anyone that thought that there was all these efforts of collusion by the administration, I think this should put a lot of those feelings to rest.
Well, Tom, how about that point that Don brings up? Because there was much being made about a Trump administration's lack of a strong arm approach with regard to the Russians. Does this dispel this now?
I think it should, but a lot of times the left-wing media and Trump's deep state critics won't stop. You know, former CIA director John Brennan was on not long ago saying that President Trump was afraid of Vladimir Putin because he might have something dirt on him. I mean, that's all clear nonsense, and that kind of information really doesn't help. It only really bolsters the Russian effort.
Do you think that this could be the influence of John Bolton, who has had a strong anti-Putin perspective, as well as Mike Pompeo now joining the Trump administration?
I believe President Trump was going in that direction, and Mr. Bolton and Mr. Pompeo are going to be the icing on the cake. And again, I think Vladimir Putin has overplayed his hand, and now he's feeling the heat from the international community.
Well, what kind of reaction do you expect from Putin, Don?
Pass a similar reaction from Moscow, where they try to go tit for tat for every one of the diplomats that we expel. I think they'll come back and counter the same, probably claiming that they're all spies and they're agents of the U.S. and the Central Intelligence Agency.
Well, it was interesting because the Russian embassy took to Twitter asking which U.S. consulates should be closed. It's a rather curious approach, wouldn't you say, Don, asking the people on Twitter to decide this?
Well, it sounds like they're taking a playbook from the president, if you ask me, when it comes to something like that.
Tom, what do you make of that?
Well, probably they just want the Russian bots to weigh in, and it's another skewed poll, I think. That's what they're up to. But if you really want to get Russia, you really have to focus in on their energy infrastructure. 70% of their exports of oil and natural gas. They want to build a new pipeline from Russia to Germany, the Nord Stream pipeline. NATO needs to pull together and stop that pipeline and get that really economic squeeze to them.
Is there will for an economic squeeze, Don? Because ultimately, some of these countries would be jeopardized by it. Certainly, the UK, London benefits tremendously from a lot of Russian oligarch money pouring into it. Is there will to take some pressure economically to this?
Well, apparently the president and Theresa May have been in conversation on this nature. I believe that there has to be some resolve that will be consequences, and that they should be able to rely on our allies to help through any situation that would arise. I'd certainly like to think so.
Tom, you look at the big picture here. Russian election, meddling in elections in the U.S. and potentially in Europe as well. Russia's role in Syria, protecting the Assad regime, looking the other way when chemical weapons are being used, preventing investigations at the United Nations into chemical weapons. Do you feel that there is a new chill in the air? Are we on the brink of another Cold War, potentially?
It has certainly been building in that direction. I have to give, a lot of the criticism to former President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, because they had this whole reset that didn't work. Who knows what promises when former President Obama whispered into Mr. Medvedev's ear and think I'll be looser next time, something along those lines. Now there's a new sheriff in town, and I think the uniting part here is the rest of the world is now really focused on Russia.
All right, Tom Borelli, appreciate it. Always good to have you on the show. And Don Bramer, thank you for your insight as well.